Well, welcome to the Unstoppable Freedom Podcast. I'm Jimmy Page. Well, it's no secret that America is in the middle of a culture war. This battle between good and evil seems to be accelerating at a head-spinning pace. What was once morally unacceptable is now not only tolerated, but celebrated. And while the church once stood as an agent for righteousness and cultural stability, it's not only largely silent, but in many ways, it's been infiltrated with woke ideology, compromising the truth, and is now actively embracing a leftist-style social activism. It seems the culture is affecting the church more than the other way around. Well, today's guest is an expert in developing next-generation leaders who live for Christ and courageously engage in preserving the culture. His name is Dr. Jeff Myers, and he's the president of Summit Ministries in Colorado. As an educator and entrepreneur, he has become one of America's most respected authorities on youth leadership development to reflect the character of Christ in the culture. He's the author of 16 books. He teaches an exclusive signature leadership course that prepares high school and college students to become leaders for Christ in the real world. Dr. Myers, welcome to the podcast.
Jimmy, great to be with you. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, buddy, this is going to be fun. Okay, so how you see the world or our worldview drives our thinking, it drives our behavior, and according to the most recent poll from Barna, we've got a big problem on our hands. It revealed in what I would consider a shocking lack of biblical worldview among American pastors. Are you familiar with that research?
I am familiar with the research, yes. So pastors, 90-some% of pastors say they believe a biblical worldview speaks to today's issues. And then Barna threw them a curveball and handed them a list of current issues and asked, how many of these have you ever addressed from the pulpit? The figure went from 90-some% down to 9%. Now, at the same time, 2/3 of people in the congregation say they want their pastor to help them figure out how to process today's issues from a biblical worldview.
Amazing.
Why don't they do it? Well, that third that doesn't want it is very vocal, very powerful. Sometimes it just isn't worth it for the pastor to receive that negative feedback. And it's hard to know whether they're really making a difference. One thing George Barna has shown is that 20% or less of American self-identified Christian churchgoers would embrace a biblical worldview. So you got 10 people in the pew, 2 of them are asking, what is actually true and how do I live it out better? 8 are asking, how does the pastor's story relate to my own story? And how am I going to speak my own truth like the pastor does? This is very discouraging for pastors, I can easily imagine.
Yeah. I mean, they have such a pressure cooker there, right? And I remember, okay, we'll go back. I don't want to go back to COVID too much because it gets us censored whenever we talk about it, to be honest. You can't say anything against the prevailing narrative today. I love this silencing and censorship. That's another show. But I think that pastors, I remember early on in the COVID disaster, I remember that tension, even talking with my pastor, amazing church here in Northern Colorado, tremendous congregation, but he was standing in the gap. And I kind of told him, you're the picture of the guy, the Stretch Armstrong. You know, you've got people on both ends of this extreme and they're both pulling at your arms. And the question is going to be, are you going to pacify both ends of the spectrum or are you going to stand for truth? And I think what we're learning is the pastors that are standing for truth, their churches are more resilient. Is that what you're seeing?
I am seeing that. I see the churches doing a good job that are focused on truth from the perspective of relationship. So I picture a DNA double helix, truth and relationship are the 2 strands. So they're connecting points all of the time. So the pastors who did a good job with this were not only the ones who said, I'm taking a stand on this, here are my reasons, but they said to the congregation, when we encounter a topic that's really tough, here is how we talk about it as Christians. Because we've got to learn to listen and ask questions as well as make our points. We've got to understand the foundation. What is the worldview behind each of the viewpoints that we're making known? Pastors who did that not only helped their congregation be more solidified, but they helped them seek truth together. There's so much, and you're involved in the world of podcasting and the internet and things like that. And you just see so much head butting.
Oh,
I'm going to drop the mic on you. No, I'm going to drop the mic on you. And it's just, what if we said, no, truth actually exists? And guess what? It isn't just a logical proposition. It isn't just a mathematical formula. It's a person. It's Jesus. This has changed the course of the world, and politics and justice and education and science and art and the value of human life in all these different areas. So let's go, instead of butting heads, let's go side by side and seek that truth.
I love that. I think you mentioned a couple things there that are real important. This idea of listening to one another, and I think that's a lost art. Unfortunately, I think most people aren't listening. In fact, we're just listening long enough so that we can say what we want to say. And the problem with that is you're not really seeking to understand. You don't have a curious heart. Instead, you've just got I'm going to convince you, or I'm going to force you, or whatever it is. The other thing that I think people are really struggling with is this hyper emotionalism, right? We're seeing everyone use emotion to try and convince or beat down or win an argument. And I think what's happening is, since they really don't know what they believe and or it's maybe not rooted on something solid, it's just based on a feeling, they have to go to this hyper emotional place in order to get their point across.
Yeah.
Is that kind of part of the problem we're experiencing?
I think it is. So in previous times, when we would hear a school say something like, we're going to teach the students only this one viewpoint and nothing else, we would say, well, then that school is a cult.
Right.
They're emotionally controlling the students. They're behaviorally controlling the students. They're controlling the thoughts of the students. That is a cult. We don't want to support that. We want to help our students figure out how to get out of it. So yes. So learning to ask questions and to listen and try to discover the truth, respecting people all the while, is not only a lost art, but it may be the only thing left that we can do to keep every aspect of our culture from devolving into this robotic, like, cult behavior.
Yeah, it's amazing. I have never heard that statement said in this context, that, if you're only expressing one opinion or one doctrine, if you will, that it becomes cult-like. And I think, in our schools, right? Our schools are kind of ground zero for some of this, right? And if you study history, of course, which you're an expert in that, if you study history at all, you understand that every single culture, every single communist or totalitarian or dictator type culture will immediately control the education. So for a great example of this is Russia coming into Ukraine. Within days of entering into Ukraine, they wiped the school curriculum from all the schools in those regions, and they began this indoctrination process of the youngest of the young. And that's what concerns me about what's happening in school today, because we are promoting a worldview, no question. The question is, why is what we're teaching in our schools so often so dangerous?
Yeah. I read a book recently called Mao's America, from a woman who grew up in communist China. And the way she describes the kind of education that she received has eerie parallels to the way schooling often takes place in America. And by the way, I say schooling, not education, on purpose, because education, the root word is duke, which means to lead out of. If you can't know the truth, then you can't lead people toward it, and you can't lead people out of error. So you can school people, but you can't educate them. So,
well, they're doing a great job at that right now.
Well, I see it happen in a lot of schools. And you listen, I'm a teacher. I was a professor for 14 years. I understand the tension that people face. You've got to try to help the kids think, and you want them to care about important things. You want them to care about other people. You want them to help make a better country. You want all of these kinds of things, but you have all these competing goals. And especially if your school district is saying, you got to teach this, you got to do this, you got to do this with pronouns or whatever, it's very, very difficult for everyday teachers to try to figure out what you ought to do. So, boy, it's more important than ever to have the relationships between parents and the teachers and the schools, and to make sure the school boards are not just advocating for what the administration wants, but advocating for what the citizens want.
Oh, imagine that. Imagine that. Gosh, you just hit on a hot button for me. We don't live in a representative republic anymore. I mean, we keep throwing this word out, democracy, which is nonsense, but because we're not a democracy, we have some democratic elements in our system, but we're a constitutional republic.
Right.
But this idea of, critical thinking and, what we're actually teaching our kids matters. You're a teacher. I've got family members that are teachers. I have a history of teachers and administrators in my family. In fact, my father was a superintendent of schools back in the days when education, I think in many ways was education. I think has changed dramatically over the last 20 to 25 years. You talk about worldview being the lens by which you look at everything, right? It is a worldview in Christ is the person of Christ. Truth is through Christ. But let's talk about some of the principles, some of the other lenses that are currently being used right now that are distorting the truth. There's a number of them, right, in our culture.
Yeah, there are.
Tell us about a couple of the ones you're seeing.
My favorite word in thinking about worldviews is patterns. A worldview is a pattern of ideas. If you want to be successful in sports, you've got to very quickly figure out the pattern of play that you will use to obtain victory over your opponent. If you want to be successful in business, you have to figure out what are the patterns of successful people in that business. Well, ideas are the same way. What you believe about God will affect what you believe about reality itself. What you believe about reality affects what you believe is right and wrong, which affects what you believe about the value of life, which affects what you believe about what makes a good society, a good political structure, good economic structure, and so forth. So I think one of the counterfeit, what I call counterfeit worldviews, because it tells enough truth to lead people to believe a bigger lie. And that is the Marxist worldview. So a biblical worldview says God created the world and he brought the world, the material world, into existence. So the immaterial world is real and the material world is real. And it is because God has given us minds and made us in his image that we can seek abundance and bring people blessing and flourishing and bring them out of suffering. The Marxist worldview says, on the other hand, only the material world exists. There's no God, there's no Jesus, there's no Holy Spirit, there's no heaven, no hell. Only the material world exists. Well, if that's true, and we do have some basic sense that we should all be equal in value, if only the material world exists and we should all be equal in value, then any person who has anything more than anyone else has stolen it. There's no other possible explanation.
Wow.
So you should steal it back. And that's not wrong. That's just. Well, that Marxist worldview, whenever it's put into play, destroys private property. It destroys trust. It destroys economic relationships. It does tear down wealthy people. So if your goal is vengeance against wealthy people, it's very good for that. But it does not build up everyday people to become more prosperous. So think of the pattern of ideas that develops from a Marxist perspective, and then go back and work on, well, what does a biblical perspective say? Just think about multiplying. The Marxist view, if only the only material world exists, then the whole world is like a pie. And if somebody's getting a bigger piece, that means somebody else is getting a smaller piece by definition. Biblical worldview says, stop trying to divide up that pie smaller and smaller, make more pies. You can actually grow value. I took an Uber. I take Uber all the time. When I travel, and Uber, I'm told, would have cost about $1 million or $1.5 million to develop that software. Now that company, the last time I checked, was worth more than $77 billion in market cap. That's more than the 3 major airlines all put together. How is that possible? They don't own a single vehicle. Well, because they decided to use their minds to help everyday people steward an asset that they have already, their personal car, in such a way that they can make money. And the average Uber driver makes 3 times minimum wage. So it's just, that's an example of how a free market approach based on the idea, no, this isn't just a material world. We have minds.
Yes.
In fact, I was with my gap year students today, Jimmy, and they were so skeptical about this. But I said, did you realize, take the top 50 valuable natural resources in the world. All 50 of them, all 50 are more abundant than when I was in high school. How is that possible?
That's outrageous.
How is that
How
possible?
is that possible?
That's crazy. Well, it's because of technology. You know, copper wires were everything when I was in high school. People said, well, we're not even going to be able to make phone calls anymore because we're going to run out of copper wire. Somebody invented fiber optic cable, which is made of glass, which is made of sand. We are not running out of sand.
Not anytime soon.
Right. You know, microchips are actually a really good example. What are microchips run the world? It is because of microchips that half the world now is able to live at a middle class level or higher. This has never happened in the course of history. Wow. What are microchips made out of? They're made out of silicon, aluminum, and oxygen, literally the three most common elements in the Earth's crust.
My gosh.
So
it's amazing.
It's incredible. Right. And then, so you look at this and realize,
can you be everyone's teacher? I mean, I'm thinking right now, we need to make you the head of education at this point.
Well, I just love when people are interested in learning and we can bring them toward the truth. But, you know, as I was looking at some of the questions, you'd sent through some questions ahead of time, and I'm super grateful for that because that gives me an idea of the direction for the conversation. But I still meet so many conservatives today who say, well, you know, it's just, it was better in the 1950s. Let's go back to the 1950s. We're not going back to the 1950s. When you say we got to go back to the 1950s to Gen Z, they're like, you know, that doesn't make any, they don't hear that. It doesn't make any sense to them.
But wouldn't you pick the 80s? I mean, let's be honest. The 80s were pretty good. Music was great.
Yeah, I could say, I've gone away from my spandex wearing days, and I don't have a lot of the hair left to do all that crazy stuff.
I'm looking for pictures on you, buddy. I'm looking for pictures.
You know, I loved Ronald Reagan, but listen, Ronald Reagan was as far in the past for today's young adults as Harry Truman was for me, and as Calvin Coolidge was for my parents. So my goal is not to try to go back to some previous time that we think was better. My goal is to preserve the core principles that make blessing and flourishing possible. And that's what I get passionate about communicating in our Summit Ministries programs.
I love that. Okay, so we're going to spend some time on that because I think there's a lot to be said there. I want to handle a couple other topics before then, but I do think that's where I want to end this conversation because it's so important about human flourishing, right? And you do mention this idea that the beauty of conservatives, and particular Christian conservatives, is that we bring about progressive change, progress, but it's all based on what I would consider unchanging principles. It's those principles that are bedrock stuff that allow us to continue to progress. So we're going to sit on that in a little bit, but let's talk a little bit more about the current ideologies, because our listeners, our parents who have kids in this system need to know what is happening in their schools. Marxism, we've been ringing the bell on Marxism for a while because it is without question anti-faith. It doesn't believe in God. In fact, one of its stated objectives is to kill God, essentially, and end this notion of God. It's anti-family. It doesn't believe in the biblical nuclear family whatsoever. In fact, it's been dismantling it for years and years. And it doesn't believe in freedom. You know, it doesn't even believe in this. All of the things that America was founded on, imperfectly, of course, it's created this divide and conquer structure. And it's happening in our schools, in our most vulnerable environment. What do parents do about it? Like, what do we do knowing that Marxism is a prevailing narrative in our schools? What do they do?
Well, there are three things that I've seen happen to help people counter a false narrative. The first thing is you've got to know the truth. So what is it that a biblical worldview gives us? And you can just talk about the 10 commandments. Take the last 3 commandments. The 9th commandment is thou shalt not bear false witness. That is not just don't lie. That is ensure the validity of contracts. Every time I use my debit card, I'm making an economic contract. Wow. Why would I assume that the merchant is not going to take more out of my bank account than the purchase price that we've agreed on? Why would the merchant assume that I'm not going to try to trick them into selling me something that I don't have the money to pay for? Because we've developed a system whereby people who are total strangers to one another can trust one another.
Right.
That is straight from a biblical worldview.
Okay, time out. Never heard that before. Okay. And that brings a whole depth to the truth, doesn't it? Right, where that one single statement, that truth has been applied narrowly, I would say. But now when you start opening it up to that, boy, that makes so much more sense for how we're ordering society and why it's so important that we can establish trust between each other in the exchange of value. In our capitalist free market system, it makes sense. Building it on biblical truth works.
Yes. That's the first thing.
Yeah.
You explain the truth. Then you expose, and this is controversial, but I believe that you expose students to the false worldviews. So they're not shocked or surprised or fascinated when they hear them for the first time in the education system.
Wow.
So I spend time on 5 different counterfeit worldviews, and this would take more than one show to kind of process through. But
Yeah.
I explain what those worldviews are in the words of the people who hold those worldviews. I don't want them to feel like I'm just setting up straw men so I can bat them down and make a cool video out of it.
Yeah.
I want them to know, no, this is what these people actually believe. And then I want them to be able to dialogue about how to respond to people who have that worldview. It turns out when you do all 3 of those things, you have the best chance of helping people counter a false narrative.
Amazing. So, I mean, I think you're right. You know, this is so intuitive. You just explained a structure that I wish I had 25 years ago with my kids. You know, like, where have you been all my life? I tried my best. I did okay. But man, this is a great formula, right? Number one is know the truth. That makes so much sense because even when you're trying to identify counterfeit $100 bills, for example, you never look at the fake stuff until you know exactly what the real stuff looks like. So once you have a clear idea of what the true thing is, then you can easily pick out the things that don't quite make it, right?
That's right. You can pick them out, and then you know what to do. So the United States Treasury Department, Secret Service, was not initially about protecting the president. They were about ensuring the validity of the United States currency by stopping counterfeiters.
What? Is that true?
That's where they came from.
That's amazing.
So they need to learn the real currency, become very familiar with it. So they're immediately suspicious when they encounter a fake bill. But then they need to know how people counterfeit bills, who the people are counterfeiting these bills, where they are, and how to go arrest them and prosecute them so they stop polluting the currency and devaluing all of our savings. So all of those things have to happen. It isn't just identifying the bills, it's what you do next. And
it's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I love it. And I think, you know, we talk a lot about giving our kids language, helping them to develop arguments, helping them to develop a defense for what they believe, for truth, so that they can easily and in a winsome way express this to other people so that they can understand it and wrestle with it themselves. There's a lot of other lenses, right? So we've got a bunch of counterfeit worldviews, and I would love, maybe that'll be another show. We'll talk about the 5 counterfeit worldviews. Let's talk about a couple more lenses that we're forcing especially our kids to look through. The lens of race, for example, you know, in our schools, this is one that is dividing our kids into oppressors and victims. It's making one side of the aisle feel guilt and shame, and the other one feel victimized, and they don't really solve it at all. In essence, they're looking at everything in life, and it's part of Marxism, I suppose, through the lens of power, specifically as it relates to race. What are you experiencing with those who are seeing everything in that divisive nature?
When you take on the oppressor-oppressed narrative, you're simplifying all of the complexity about the world into a simple formula. And simple formulas explain only very simple things. Yep. They do not account for the complexity of the world. So the nature of race it's difficult, it's tricky. It is the case that in many parts, even in the United States today, in many parts of the country, people who are of African heritage don't get a fair shake. It's tough. And they have a hard time, and they might be suspicious of authority figures because they may have actually encountered discrimination because of those authority figures, but that I might not have experienced growing up in a small town in central Kansas, right? So my life experience was very, very different. I understand that. But then to say, well, then, therefore, race, especially black versus white, is going to be the lens through which we view everything else, immediately begins to break down.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing all kinds of things
Mm.
happen. I think this is a fascinating time right now where you're watching, say, the Democratic Party bleed black support.
Mm. Yeah.
And it's not that our black friends know exactly, where they would go, what they would do. It's not like they're all excited about Trump right now, but
Right.
they're thinking, well, wait a second, this narrative does not explain my life. It does not give me a vision for where I want to go. It does not bring reconciliation. Now, why would that be the case? Okay, so you mentioned Marxism as probably part of that framework. Why?
Yeah.
What is it about Marxism that led us to this place? Okay, well, the Marxist worldview develops everything in terms of what is called dialectical materialism. Remember, materialism, only the material world exists. The dialectic, everything is opposing forces, just like we have light and dark. Everything is an opposing force. So this came from Hegel way back in the day, in the 1700s, and his book, Phenomenology of Spirit, extraordinarily complicated book to try to read, but this is the basic aspect of it. The way society advances is through conflict. So point A wins the day. Everybody's all excited about point A. And then somebody else comes along and says, well, point B actually might be better. And then eventually they clash. Out of that comes some sort of a synthesis, point C. And then that synthesis becomes the new thing that everybody believes until something else comes along. But you have to have clash. You have to have conflict in order for society to advance. That's the Hegelian dialectic, which Marx then took and baptized in materialism. That became the basis of the Marxist worldview. So from a Marxist perspective, we want this conflict to take place.
Yeah,
the worse it is, the bloodier it is, the more likely it will be that we will advance toward communism later on.
Yeah.
So you'll never hear a Marxist talk about racial reconciliation, for example.
Of course.
But from a biblical worldview, that would be a primary goal. We should learn to reconcile. We should learn that every human being bears God's image. And the amount of melanin in their skin does not affect that. They're a living soul. Their soul will live forever, and they're extraordinarily valuable. And we should treat one another in that way. That's one of those core principles. We're not trying to turn back the clock to a previous time. I don't want to live in a museum. I love to visit museums. I don't want to live there. I want that core. That's one core principle that has to be preserved. Every human being bears God's image. When we start with that, rather than the idea that we should try to promote conflict because that's how society will advance, we actually have gotten ourselves 2/3 of the way to the solution.
Yeah. And I think the Jesus model would be to seek, as you said, to seek reconciliation or to seek unity. I hate, it's almost like they're in search of a problem. We're going to create problems so that we create conflict, so that we create this, this road to communism. And that's, most people don't realize that Marxism is just a vehicle on the way to communism.
Any kind of conflict could be helpful. Then. It could be rich versus poor, owners of the factory versus the workers in the factory, rural people versus urban people, gays versus straights, young versus old, any kind of conflict that you can come up with. And so the part of the problem is the way journalism works is it creates interest through conflict. And it does tend to simplify things down to us versus them. Well, Marxism takes that and tries to apply it to everything in the world, and the results are disastrous.
Yeah, and I just have this horrible, this strong resistance to the idea that any kid who, by the way, doesn't think through the lens of race, not a single kid does. In fact, I would be hard pressed to find one. And we're now superimposing this division between their neighbor here, who's actually their friend, and they love him. And all of a sudden, they're told that, oh wait, we're on opposite sides of the fence, and you're really bad, and all your people are bad, and you guys are all victim. It's just a mess. And so I think it's child abuse. I mean, that's a whole nother topic, but I think this is abusive. And I also don't know very many parents that are on board with this indoctrination and this confusion that we're creating in the classroom. Let me give you another one. I'll let you comment on. Climate. Okay, so climate is like race. Well, I hate to cut in right now when we're in such a rich conversation with my new friend, Dr. Jeff Myers and Summit Ministries. But I want to encourage you. This is just part one of a two-part series. Stay tuned for next week's episode. You won't want to miss it.